Hello, today we're talking about Eric Birling, one of the more minor characters in J B Priestley's spellbinding 1945 thriller Inspector Calls. Nevertheless, Eric has a significant impact on the play, and also he's got a significant function within it. The stage directions that kick off Act 1 gives a very clear insight into Eric's character. He's described as being not quite at ease and being half shy, half assertive. Now what this reveals early doors about Eric is that there's a real anxiety that bubbles away at his core. And one of the things we can do as A-star students in waiting is consider why he's so awkward, why he's so anxious. Now my theory is this: he's anxious because he does not like what the future heralds for him. He's been trained up by his dad to be this captain of industry, this exploiter of the poor, and this doesn't sit too well with Eric. As we see increasingly as the play goes on, Eric harbours socialist views, socialist values. He has a genuine concern for the common man, and it's very difficult for him to reconcile these humane, community-orientated urges and impulses with that need to be a brutal, callous capitalist, slashing labour costs to maximise profits. So that anxiety then that characterises Eric stems from the fact that he realises that he's going to have to compromise on these socialist values if he's going to cut it in Daddy's factory, taking the whip hand to the worker. It's significant that Eric's first contribution to the play is not in words but in actions. The stage directions say that Eric suddenly guffaws, which means he barks out a laugh. He just utters this jarring note into the relaxed celebratory dinner party. And what does it do, this jarring note? Well, it helps to contribute to that atmosphere of tension that bubbles away, even in this early stage of the play when they're supposedly celebrating the engagement of Gerald and Sheila. Eric's barking laugh then just contributes to that aura of unease and helps to foreshadow Inspector Gould's arrival and the traumas that follow on the back end of that. It's very interesting to look at some of the stage directions that give the actor playing Eric a bit of guidance on how to deliver certain lines, the tone to adopt. Some of these stage directions say his lines should be delivered sharply or uneasily, defiantly, and at one stage he suddenly bursts out. So I think what this is highlighting is that Eric is being used as a tool by J B Priestley to keep the tension, the anxiety, that sense of unease ticking over in this play and keeping the audience engaged. A secondary interpretation for this barking laugh, because we know an examiner loves it when you can pull out two meanings for one bit of evidence. A secondary interpretation is that this barking laugh being an action, not a word, and a kind of very crude action at that, foreshadows the revelation later in the play of his other crude action, namely the rape of Eva Smith. It's implied in Act 3, I believe, that he raped Eva. And much like the guffaw, the rape was born of excessive alcohol consumption and a kind of generic lack of self-control. Eric's drinking. He's got a real love of the liquor, as Eric loves to chuck it down him like it's going out of fashion. And there's two things I think we can say about this. I've said before, examiners love it and you can pull out multiple interpretations. So here's the first. Firstly, I mentioned this earlier, Eric is unhappy with the role he's going to have to adopt in life. He's going to have to become like his dad, become this brutal, callous capitalist, and that doesn't quite square with the socialist values he harbours in his heart. So that's one reason he drinks. It's like a pressure valve, a crutch to ease the tension. Secondly, all the members of the Birling family and Joel Croft commit a biblical sin against Eva Smith. And this is J B Priestley's very clever way of implying or inferring that capitalism is intrinsically immoral, or evil even, because of course the Birlings and Gerald are representatives of that bourgeois class. So that's two things we can say. Eric's drinking is a sin because it's the sin of gluttony, and with the rape it leads to the sin of lust. And secondly, it helps him to cope with the, or here's a nice A-star phrase for it, helps him to cope with the existential crises that he's suffering, having to reconcile his socialist values with the role society will force him to adopt as a capitalist exploiter of the proletariat. Right from the off, Gerald displays an antagonism towards his dad, which escalates or balloons as the play progresses. For instance, when Mr. Birling is banging on with himself, assuring us that the Titanic won't sink and union agitations will eventually evaporate, Eric pipes up with, "What about war?" And when Mr. Birling answers him, Eric continues, "Yes, but still." So one way of reading, one way of interpreting this conflict between father and son is seeing it as a conflict between socialism and capitalism. Mr. Birling, of course, represented those capitalist views, that self-interest, putting the individual above the community, and Eric embracing a more community-orientated ethos, a more socialist set of values. That's one way that you can read that conflict between them. The second way of reading that conflict is about as A-star as it gets, because what's played out when Eric challenges his dad consistently, what's presented or highlighted there is something known as the Oedipus Complex. What Sigmund Freud, the godfather of psychology and psychiatry, says is a boy's natural subconscious urge to denigrate and challenge the father, to rebel against his authority. So there's two ways of reading that antagonism, that conflict between father and son. Socialism versus capitalism, and a playing out, a manifestation of the Oedipus complex. A bit like his sister, Eric has been cushioned from reality by the family's wealth. He's patronised by his parents. They talk about his silly mood, and Mrs. Birling defends him by saying he's only a boy. So this is one of the reasons why he's quite spoiled. His parents treat him like a child, and he's never really had to grow up and face the harsh realities of the world. Mr. Birling says at one point, "You've a lot to learn yet," and he talks about his public school and varsity life. So Eric's never really had to get a job. He's never had to worry about where the next meal's coming from. He's never had to worry about the stability and the security of the roof over his head. And that means he's spoiled. And perhaps this is why he kind of seeks pleasure irrespective of cost, because he's been kind of infantilised by mummy and daddy, and he's never had to mature and grow up. And like a child, he'll take his pleasures irrespective of the pain and the hurt that it causes. Something Eva Smith learns about him at great cost to herself. Unless you're president of his fan club, then, you've got to admit that Eric Birling is a man not short of faults. He's a self-absorbed alcoholic, possibly a rapist. However, we do see in Eric a genuine concern for the plight of the poor, and this manifests itself very early on. When Mr. Birling suggests that Eva could go and work anywhere because it's a free country, Eric replies, "It isn't if you can't go and work someplace else." And he also says at some point, "Why shouldn't she try for higher wages? We try for the highest prices." So what's interesting about Eric here is that he sees common ground, not difference, with the proletariat. He's not like Mrs. Birling, quick to denigrate and sneer at the poor. There's a real sense of equality that underpins a lot of Eric's sentiments and statements. We're all in it for the same thing. Money. The poor need money to survive. We want to create profit. So I guess where Mrs. Birling seeks division, Eric seeks unification. He's got kind of warmer, more generous nature than his iceberg of a mother. Perhaps because of his pampered upbringing, he's never really had to face real stress. Eric's very quick to buckle under the pressure of the inspector's menacing presence. He bursts out, that's the stage direction, bursting out in Act 1. Look here, I've had enough of this. So perhaps one of the reasons he cannot cope with the stress of the inspector's visit is because he's not been conditioned to deal with real stress and real problems. He's been in his little cocoon, his little bubble of wealth, hasn't he? Secondly, though, as I said before, Eric is a tool used by Priestley to maintain tension in the play. Tension, if you like, is like a magnet. It keeps the audience attracted to what's going on stage. Also, for a whacking great chunk of Act 2, Eric disappears. He goes AWOL, he slams the front door and off he toddles. And even his absence adds tension to proceedings because the inspector insists that he needs to talk to him. One measure or kind of index of this tension is when the stage directions say that Mr. and Mrs. Birling exchange frightened glances. Eric Birling then, a lean, mean, tension-generating machine. And that's the end of this video, this first video looking at the character of Eric Birling.